Former President Trump recently told women, "You will be protected and I will be your protector." What do you make of that?
So he who, when he was president, hand-selected 3 members of the United States Supreme Court with the intention that they would undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. And they did just as he intended. I was the first vice president or president to ever, in office, go to a reproductive health care clinic, ever.
Really?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I didn't know that, but I guess that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. To your point.
And yet the men are making the decisions about our bodies.
That is Vice President Kamala Harris appearing on the Call Her Daddy podcast this weekend. That podcast is hosted by Alex Cooper and reaches an average of 5 million listeners a week with a largely female audience. The interview mainly focused on women's rights and kicks off a media blitz for the Democratic presidential candidate, who's also set to appear on Howard Stern, The View, and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. What's behind the strategy? Let's bring back the front bench: Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, George Soule, and Najoud Al-Malise. Najoud, I'll start with you because I asked you in the break, did you listen? Because all the girls in our office had listened this morning. Like, it is, I know she's getting criticism for it, but it is a massive podcast with a massive female audience who might, younger voters who might not be motivated to come out. I imagine that's the audience she's hoping to target with this.
Yeah, I think there was 2 important reasons for her to go on that podcast. Kamala doesn't talk a lot about her being a woman running for president, but she does talk a lot about reproductive rights, an issue that's very important to women and young women. And so going on a podcast where the audience is girls, young women, the host is seized by this issue of women's rights and reproductive rights, the calculation there made sense. And then the second fold is that at a time when the Democrats are trying to energize young people to come out and vote, I think meeting them where they're at and, talking in a language that they understand makes absolute sense. And so, we've seen Kamala Harris do a lot of the traditional interviews, but I think going on a podcast like this isn't about necessarily a rollout of policy or to answer accountability questions. It's about showcasing who you are, and young people really want to see that you're an authentic leader. And you see in that she was able to keep up in that style with Alex Cooper. And so there's 2 strong reasons for her to do it. And again, the people who didn't like it, they're not the ones listening to the podcast anyway, so it doesn't really matter in that sense.
Yeah, Shakir, I sort of feel like, look, I live and breathe traditional media. I don't look at it as a zero-sum game. Like, I think if leaders were escaping accountability, which is the type of interview I do, then it's a different story. But I think they're allowed to do both. And I listen to the other type. I don't conduct it, but I listen to it with interest. Like, if it was done without any other, like she did 60 Minutes last night, as traditional as you can get, right? If she weren't doing that and only doing this more light stuff, it'd be a different story. But I don't know. It seems like if it's a mix, I don't feel like you can avoid that in this day and age.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you have to be on kind of other platforms and other mediums, right? Just the kind of traditional news, those audiences aren't increasing. And you have podcasts, like you said in your intro, that have millions and millions of viewers, and you want to hit those. You want to hit those potential voters. I think the thing with Kamala is that there's just been a lot of criticism about her being in these audiences, being in these interviews, getting asked tough questions. And so it's good to see her out here, kind of showcasing what she has and putting it on the table. I think the one thing with podcasts that I will say though is that at the end of the day, these are not hard-hitting interviews, right? These are very softball questions, just the same way the Prime Minister went on Stephen Colbert. It wasn't a hard-hitting interview. And I think for Camilla, looking as you're facing an election in about a month, I think one of her biggest issues right now is there are a lot of folks who don't know what she was going to do, right? They don't know if she's elected president of the United States, what would she actually do as president? And I think 60 Minutes is a good platform to be on, but there needs to be more communicating about if I'm elected, here's what I'm going to lead into. I think we all get this notion of reproductive rights, which is a great issue to champion and move forward on, but there's a lot of issues around the economy, around inflation, around crime, around border security, that I'm not sure that a lot of Americans are actually understanding what she's actually going to do moving forward. So a little bit more meat would be helpful for her as we head to Election Day.
It'll be really interesting to see, Dan, what the strategy looks like over the next month. Like I mentioned what she's doing this week, but to Shakir's point, like Pete Buttigieg goes on Fox News. He goes on all these sort of somewhat combative interviews and he lands his message more frequently than not, even in the face of those kinds of interviews. It'd be interesting to see if she ends up pursuing something like this or like that, pardon me, or stays the course in this way.
I'm not sure adversarial interviews make sense for the presidential candidate right now. I think Kamala Harris needs to focus on motivating pretty narrow sectors of voters that are going to be really important to her in turnout in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Georgia, frankly, where North Carolina, where she has to have young women motivated to show up and vote at the polls. That's why she did this podcast, because reproductive rights matter a great deal to those voters. And the stakes going into the election need to be clear. It is clear that this is a tight race. That is one thing that is very certain to, I think, all voters and everyone watching this race very closely right now, is that the margin for error is very minimal here. And so turning out those voters that care a lot about those issues is paramount to her closing message in this campaign. She's got to get them excited. She's got to get them motivated to get out to the polls. And I think we'll see her continue to lean into a strategy that focuses very heavily on turning out women voters in particular, right? Like, that is going to be the most important demographic from a turnout standpoint for her on election day.
Dan brings up a really interesting point. In this last sort of, speed run to the end, George, is it going to be focused on primarily how to get people who probably will support you out, or are there still going to be efforts made to convince that, those 500,000 undecided voters in those swing states to actually decide to vote for the Democrats versus like motivating people who have already decided?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. And that's the case in any campaign, but especially in the states thing now where things have become so solidified that it really is those margins that matter so much. Yes, it was a good interview on reproductive health, but that didn't have to be where the interview went. Alex Cooper, before at the beginning of the podcast, said that she wrote this interview, prepared for it 7 different ways, and then at the end decided to keep it to herself, to her own style, rather than going hard-hitting. But she also said that the vice president didn't restrict any topics at all, so it could have gone anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that it's as much about the topic, but also just getting to people where they're at. Like, we can't have people wringing our hands about the fact that young people aren't voting,
right, and
then getting mad when politicians go out there to find young people. I mean, Donald Trump went on Impulsive, and we don't need to get into Jake Paul and all the problems there, but I'm waiting for Kamala Harris to go on the Hot Ones, because I think that'd be a great interview. But I think
know a lot about podcasts. Yeah.
It really is all about getting there to where people are, and that's what politicians have to do. And the last point I'll make, I also think, frankly, more and more politics is about who you are. It's one thing to have politicians go on hard-hitting interviews, and you're really good at digging past the talking points sometimes. But we often see ministers come on this show and just stick to talking points and seem rigid the whole time. So they can just say what they're going to do, but knowing who that person is, who is the person that's going to be the most powerful person in the world, is more important to me than what their key messages are on 1 or 2, more hot button issues. So to speak.
I think it can be both. Go ahead.
I was just going to add to that point. I mean, about knowing who you are, especially at a time when trust is so low in politicians and institutions. Like, just showing who you are becomes more and more important.
I think answering questions honestly that are accountability ones about what you're going to do is also another way you can show who you are. But because by deduction, I can figure out who you are when you don't. But also, yes, meeting people where they are makes sense. I think you can do both. Okay, I got to stop there. Thanks, everyone, for a great discussion. George Soul, Najoud Al-Malez, Shakir Chambers, and Dan Moulton, our front bench. We're back in just a moment.